So welcome everybody. For those who I don't know, my name is Rabbi Mark Katz, and I want to welcome those who are new to our congregation, who have maybe not been here before. A hearty welcome. We are really excited to have you here tonight. This is part of a general series where we talk to important civic leaders, thought leaders, really important voices in the community about some of the social justice and civic issues that are the most important to not only our community, but I think to the world at large. And so to have Sundeep here, who really is an expert in the field of civil rights, to talk about what the state is doing, what he is doing, and how we might get involved, I think is really powerful and wonderful. Now, before we start, I want to say a quick thank you. Carrie Shavat is really the brains behind this series. And so thanks to him, we've had a number of wonderful speakers, and tonight is no exception. I'm going to just get out of the way very quickly and give the speakers a chance to talk tonight. But right before I do, I just want to say the idea of standing up for values is something that, at least in our community, we take very seriously. And in our community, when so many people are hated, when so much oppression is around us, when there's violence, even that hit our own doorstep with anti-Semitism, it becomes all the more important to look at how we can make a difference in this world, how we can build bridges, how we can build bonds, and how together we can find our way out of this darkness into the light. And so we're going to hear tonight just exactly how our state is doing that, and how we might be able to participate in that process. So our two speakers tonight. So interviewing is going to be Amy Winkelman. Amy, in addition to all the many other accolades that I'm sure she has, is the vice president of Tikkun Olam here at our congregation. But she also is a proven interviewer. She did an amazing job when the AG came, and so we know she's going to do a great job tonight. She's currently employed as the Associate General Counsel at Moody's Corporation, and she primarily handles regulatory risk and litigation matters. And from 1992 to 2008, she served as an assistant U.S. attorney at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey in various roles, including the chief of the criminal division. And so we want to welcome her. Sundeep Iyer is the director of the New Jersey Division on Civil Rights. He leads the state agency charged with enforcing New Jersey's civil rights laws. He previously served as Assistant Attorney General and Senior Counsel to Attorney General Matthew J. Platkin. In that capacity, he was the Attorney General's principal advisor on civil rights matters, and he coordinated department-wide civil rights initiatives. He also worked with the Office of the Solicitor General on appeals involving matters of constitutional law, statutory interpretation, civil rights, and criminal law. Prior to joining the Office of the Attorney General, Iyer was a senior associate at Hogan Lovells US LLP. And during that time at the firm, he served as a special attorney for the state of Minnesota in the prosecution of the 4 former police officers charged in connection with the death of George Floyd. So there's a lot more to his story, which I'm sure that we'll hear a little bit more tonight. But what I do want to say on a personal note is that when the firebombing did happen at our congregation a number of months ago, Sundeep immediately came forward and he said, you know, how can I be helpful? He showed up at meetings with us. He and I met, and he has been a really wonderful advocate, a really wonderful a wonderful ally to the Jewish community, as he is to so many others. And so I want to give my personal thanks to you and our whole congregation as well. Now, we also have a number of people who co-sponsored tonight. I actually didn't print out that list, but I know the Federation of Greater Metro West, JCRC, is a part of tonight, as well as the NAACP, as well as Out Montclair. Did I forget anybody else? And so thank you to our partners as well. And I turn things over to you, Amy.
Well, so you have to tell me, is this working? Though I think I can bellow loud enough anyway, but Sundeep, we are so happy to have you here, not least because you are a landsman living, that's Yiddish for fellow traveler, if you will, living in Glen Ridge. So we're really thrilled about that. And I understand that you are originally from New Jersey and that you were raised here, the son of immigrants. So will you tell us a little bit about your story?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. It's so nice to be with you tonight. Thanks so much, Amy, for doing this. Thanks to Rabbi Katz for having me. Thanks to Carrie for putting this wonderful event together. Uh, I grew up here in New Jersey. I'm born and raised here in the state. I grew up all over the state. Started in Monmouth County, moved up to Morris County, then Somerset County, and I found my way up here to Essex County. As Amy mentioned, am the kid of immigrants from India, and I think that has shaped a lot of why I'm here doing the work that I do today. I remember growing up, the moment when my parents got their citizenship and the first time that they went to go vote. And it's something that, a lot of us frankly take for granted in our day-to-day lives, but I remember how meaningful that experience was for them. And I think part of what was so meaningful about it was, as an immigrant here, you often feel like you're a little bit out of place, like you're struggling to find your place here. And I know my parents had that experience as well. But getting to vote, being part of this civic community, I think it meant so much to them. And seeing that made me really passionate about wanting to make sure that other people had those same opportunities, that other people could be part of the civic community that we all share in here. And I think it is so much of why I've ended up becoming a civil rights lawyer and spending my career on these issues.
Did you experience any bias incidents growing up as the son of Indian immigrants?
Yeah, I did. And I think I'm not unusual in this respect. I have been called all kinds of names growing up. Fortunately, it hasn't happened to me in a long time, but I've been called a monkey, I've been called a terrorist, I've been called a dothead. I know my parents were subjected to similar slurs, and luckily, in my case, I have never been subject to violence on the basis of what I look like or what I believe, but I know that is not a uniform experience, that people unfortunately face what I faced and so much worse in their day-to-day lives. I mean, we're living with palpable reminders here of the kinds of violence and hatred that can sometimes drive people. Uh, and I certainly have seen some of that, and I've lived with a little bit of it firsthand. And I think that too shapes why bias and hate are such critical issues for me here in New Jersey. Growing up here in New Jersey, I experienced it. I know it's still happening. And unfortunately, bias and hate are on the rise, continue to be on the rise across the state. And I know it shapes a lot of the work that my division does and our department does as a whole.
Thank you. And we're definitely going to want to hear about the work that your division does and that you are leading, but the rabbi didn't read your full bio, which I understand, because it's lengthy and very impressive. Let me just say, for the benefit of people here, he clerked for a Supreme Court justice, so this is the level we're talking about. But you also had a chance to participate in some of the most prominent civil rights litigations that have taken place in certainly the past 5 or 6 years, both the George Floyd, the prosecution of the murders of George Floyd, and the travel ban litigation that was ushered in with the last presidency. And I think we want to get to the Division on Civil Rights, obviously, but if you could share with us some of your observations about working on those litigation teams, and how those play into your understanding of our justice system and what our country is and perhaps could be. No
Yeah.
small order, but I think you can do it.
I think both of those moments, the travel ban when President Trump first came into office and the murder of George Floyd, I think are visible reminders of how progress works and doesn't work. I think sometimes we like to tell ourselves a story about civil rights and progress in civil rights being linear. And that's far from the reality. For every moment of progress we have, we also can point to setbacks like the travel ban or like the murder of George Floyd. And I think the thing that I have taken away from those experiences more than anything is the importance for people, at least in my position, who are privileged to be able to do the work, to continue to go out and advocate on behalf of the causes you believe in, to fight against the things that you think are toxic to our country, our civic fabric. And that's something that continues to stay with me now. I think working on civil rights issues, you see setbacks. You see setbacks all the time. You see them happening nationally in other parts of the country, but you also see them here in New Jersey. And the question I always ask myself in the moments of despair that I feel, and I know so many of you feel in those moments, is what are we going to do? And to me, the answer is to always figure out the way to try and do the work. And the work is hard, and it sometimes is thankless, but I think it's incredibly important that all of us, and I think all of us have a role to play in this, continue to go out and fight for the causes that we believe in. And I think my experience with both of those matters, the travel ban and the George Floyd case, are in many respects some of the hardest things I have ever had to work on and probably will ever have to work on. But in the moments that I was doing that work, I was also regularly reminded that there were people who were feeling pain in those moments, the depth of which I couldn't appreciate given my lived experience and the privilege and the good fortune that I have. And I think having that privilege makes it all the more important to recognize the effect that events like that can have on other people who don't share that privilege, and to use that privilege to try and do more, to try and do better, to try and do the work.
Thank you. In researching a little bit about your office and in preparation for this interview, I looked a little bit into the history of the law against discrimination, which I think you're going to be talking to us about. And it's pretty striking. I think it was the first such piece of legislation in the United States.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And there's a rich tradition in New Jersey around that law and around the protections. I think New Jersey was one of the first, was among the first states to extend the prohibition against discrimination to based on sexual orientation. And at the same time, we all know that there is a long and rich history of racial discrimination and violence in practice in New Jersey. So it seems to me that we've got really good laws on the books. Then the question is, how do we enforce them? How do we get them into the DNA of how people live? And I thought it would be helpful for those of you who aren't law geeks like myself if you could kind of explain the different roles of state government in addressing civil rights and, what your office does versus what other branches of state government do.
Yeah, sure. Let me start maybe by just pointing out a couple of the other ways in which our laws are unique in their breadth and the extent of the protection that they provide our residents. Thanks to Governor Murphy, we have the strongest equal pay statute in the country, bar none. That statute applies not just to gender, as the federal law does, but it applies to a whole host of protected characteristics. And it doesn't just say equal pay for equal work. It says equal pay for substantially similar work. And that may not sound like a big difference, but it's actually a huge difference in a court. Another example, we have the first state law of its kind in the country called the Fair Chance in Housing Act. And that's a statute, we'll talk a little bit more about it, I think, later, that generally prohibits discrimination in housing on the basis of a prior criminal record. That's a really big deal because we know that barriers to housing are often one of the single greatest barriers to successful reentry for people coming out of prison. So we've got really good law in New Jersey, and I think that's due in no small part to the Murphy administration. It's also due, I think, to generations before us. As you said, 1945 was the very first state anti-discrimination law in the country. But good law without enforcement, it's basically just a press release. It's just a piece of paper. You got to enforce the law in order for it to mean something. And we have a whole host of tools within the Attorney General's office for enforcing these laws. On the one hand, there's criminal enforcement of the law, and that's something that you see our police and our prosecutors handle. Our division doesn't do criminal enforcement. Instead, it focuses on civil enforcement, on focusing on violators of the law in employment, in housing, in any place that's open to the public. They're called places of public accommodation, which is just a fancy way of saying a place that's open to the public. And we have the ability to hold people accountable, to pay penalties, to provide remedies for people who have faced discrimination. And I think those are really powerful tools. But again, those powerful tools are just words on a piece of paper if we don't actually use them. And that's the priority for me as the director of the Division on Civil Rights here, is to make sure that these aren't just words on a page and that we're using our authority to the full extent possible to ensure that people have the rights that they're guaranteed under our laws.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Fair Chance at Housing Act, because that's something that I'm looking at. Trish Perlmutter, I'm looking at you. That members of our congregation played an active role in supporting and contacting their assembly people and advocating for the passage of that law. Can you give us an example of how your division goes about enforcing that? I mean, how you build a case, how do you get the information? How do you build a case for a situation where, I guess to back up for a minute, it's as I understand it, and you'll flesh this out for me, that law prohibits housing providers from requiring applicants for housing to answer questions about criminal history, at least in a first round of application. Yep. So how do you investigate violations of that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's a little too easy right now to enforce the law because there's so many people across the state, so many housing providers that continue to facially violate the law. We don't have to spend a lot of time on Zillow or Redfin to find advertisements that say, sorry, no criminal history. So we've brought a whole host of enforcement actions. One of the first things that I shepherded through in my time as director was we brought a set of 60 enforcement actions against housing providers all across the state for engaging in exactly that basic form of discrimination, telling people, whether it's in an advertisement or in an application, sorry, we're not even going to consider your application because you have a prior criminal history. I think once you get past that initial layer of discrimination, the enforcement gets a little tougher. And I think if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that discrimination evolves to evade detection. And so it's important that we be really vigilant and understand the ways in which discrimination evolves. And one of the things that we're paying attention to now is sometimes someone will call and say, I've got a criminal record. Is that going to be a problem for you? And the landlord will say, yeah, that's a problem. That's a clear violation. And our job is to bring in an enforcement action there. But sometimes the landlords will wisen up a bit and they'll say, oh yeah, we'll accept your application. Go ahead, send it in. And the person will just never get contacted again. And that's the form of discrimination that is harder for us to capture, and we've still got ways to capture it, and that's exactly what we're focusing on at the Division on Civil Rights. But my point is that the discrimination evolves over time, and you see this in all kinds of areas in civil rights, where there might have been really simple forms of discrimination 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. That discrimination is still happening today, but it's just happening in a different form that's a little harder to detect. That's maybe a little bit more, I hesitate to use this term, but quote unquote sophisticated, right? People are discriminating in ways that are designed to evade detection, and our job is to stay one step ahead and try and tackle that so that it doesn't become an issue that prevents people from obtaining housing.
On the topic of housing, in talking to you, I think you mentioned that your office still sees mortgage redlining. Is that still taking place?
Yeah, unfortunately. Let me back up maybe and provide a little bit of context here. So back in the 1930s and the 1940s, the federal government, and let me just pause on that for a second. The federal government was engaging in a practice of systematically dividing neighborhoods, largely on the basis of race or other what they deemed to be undesirable characteristics. And they made decisions about who to give mortgages to and who to give credit to on that basis. And so what you'll find today, and you can actually go online and take a look at the old mortgage redlining maps, there's a very strong correlation between the neighborhoods that were quite literally colored in red because they were, again, quote unquote, undesirable, and the communities here in our state today that are still struggling with the effects of that, struggling with poverty, struggling with foreclosure crises. Again, discrimination evolves over time. Federal government's not doing that anymore. But private mortgage companies, private lenders, continue to this day to engage in systematic practices that are designed to deny credit to Black and brown communities in our state and across the country. One of the things I'm most proud of that our division has worked on was last year we reached a landmark settlement with Trident Mortgage Company. This is a mortgage company that's part of the Berkshire Hathaway brand of companies. And that company engaged in systematic mortgage redlining in the Camden area. What do? First of all, they decided we're not going to put any of our offices in majority Black areas. They decided in our advertisements, we're only going to feature white people, and we're going to target those advertisements towards communities with high concentrations of white people and not towards communities with Black and brown people. And this was unfortunately apparent in the record. Their loan officers were making racist remarks about people who were applying for loans. So we secured with them ultimately, after litigation, a $20 million settlement, which at the time was the largest mortgage redlining settlement in the federal government's history. And we partnered with the federal government and Pennsylvania and Delaware, because this was happening in Camden, it was happening in Philadelphia, it was happening in Wilmington. And as part of that settlement, we required the mortgage company to provide loan subsidies for future applicants from Black and brown communities. And those subsidies are now, as we speak, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in new mortgages, because it turns out it doesn't take a whole lot of a subsidy in order to make the difference between someone being able to get a mortgage and someone not being able to get a mortgage. And so, unfortunately, mortgage redlining is still happening. It's still pervasive, I think, in a lot of parts of the country. And it's a focus for us at the Division on Civil Rights. We've got to be able to find those individuals, those companies that are violating the law. And those cases are not easy to build. And I know they're not easy to build because it takes years and it takes an enormous investment of our staff's time. But it is absolutely worth the effort because at the end of the day, practices like mortgage redlining are what drive the wealth gap in our state. New Jersey Institute for Social Justice put out a study a couple of years ago. Median household wealth for white families in the state, about $330,000. Median household wealth for Black families, $17,000. 20 times different. And the driver of that, an enormous driver of that, is differences in home ownership. Black families in the state, about 38% of them own homes. Compare that to white families, 76% own homes. So this is something that drives wealth inequality. It drives the cycles of poverty that Black and brown communities across our state continue to experience. So it has to be something that we as a state prioritize.
To try to close that generational wealth gap.
Yeah.
And what about, since so many people rent homes or rent apartments, what kinds of programs or initiatives is your division focusing on for renters to prevent discrimination?
One of the most important programs that exists for people who are renting is governmental assistance programs like Section 8 vouchers. During the pandemic, the state afforded COVID emergency funds. And our law is one of the strongest in the country, our law against discrimination, because it prohibits discrimination on the basis of your source of income. In other words, if you have a government voucher, you can't be denied housing. You can't be denied a rental opportunity. But that discrimination continues to happen all across our state. We continue to see that most basic form of discrimination, the Zillow ad or the Redfin ad that has, sorry, no Section 8 in it. That's a facial violation of our law. And we have taken action and will continue to take action to deal with that. But there are also other forms of discrimination that are now emerging as landlords and realtors that have an interest in preventing people with vouchers from renting in their properties. We're trying to deal with those same quote-unquote ghosting practices, where someone with a Section 8 voucher will call and just won't get a response from a housing provider. And it's critical that we provide enforcement of our anti-discrimination laws in those circumstances. The challenge in New Jersey, I think, is unfortunately really stark when it comes to housing, and housing costs continue to increase across the state. The Legal Services of New Jersey just put out a report. Back in 1960, for someone who was at the federal poverty level, housing was about 30% of their income. Today, monthly housing costs for someone who's at the federal poverty level, about 85% of their income. So it's a huge challenge across the state, and Section 8 vouchers are incredibly valuable. Governmental assistance is incredibly valuable because it's what makes the difference between someone being able to be in a home and not. And so we have to remain committed to addressing discrimination against Section 8 voucher holders and other recipients of government rental assistance.
Thank you. Another topic that is of particular interest to our community, but I think our region as a whole, is protecting the rights of LGBTQ members of our community. And I guess I was a little too complacent about the situation on the ground for for such discrimination, assuming that it wasn't taking place. But I think you're going to tell us that your division has seen and worked to prevent or remediate violations of those that type of discrimination.
Yeah. Maybe I'll start just one step back by contextualizing New Jersey within the broader national conversation on this. In this legislative session alone across the country, we've seen almost 500 pieces of legislation in various states across the country targeting the LGBTQ community. And that takes all kinds of forms. Sometimes it's cutting back on protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. Sometimes it's targeting the books that are in libraries. And
Including in our town of Glen Ridge.
I was going to say a thing
That failed, let me just say, but yeah.
a thing we know a little bit about in Glen Ridge. There are a lot of other kinds of efforts too, efforts to prevent people from changing their identity documents so that their gender is in accordance with their gender identity. Efforts at schools to prevent trans youth from participating in school activities and athletics in accordance with their gender identity. So these efforts are pervasive. And in New Jersey, on a state level, we're taking a very different approach. We're choosing the path of inclusion, not the path of exclusion. And we're using our state resources to try and support the LGBTQ community. Governor Murphy just, about a couple weeks ago, just signed an executive order declaring New Jersey a safe haven for transgender individuals who wish to receive gender-affirming care. We as a state continue to take action to try and ensure that gender-affirming care is available to anyone who needs it here in the state. But I don't think that means that there are no problems. We're far from that as a state. And what we've seen and what Amy was alluding to here in New Jersey is there have been a number of municipalities that continue to publish on their websites information indicating that same-sex marriage is not available. In other words, that they say on their website, and it's outdated information, they say marriage is only available between opposite-sex couples. And so we as the Division on Civil Rights took enforcement action against all of those municipalities. There were 5 municipalities that did that, and another 28 municipalities across the state that have used gendered language in describing who can apply for a marriage license and using that language on their applications, meaning someone has to swear under oath to a gender identity that they don't subscribe to. So there are problems across the state, and I think we are also seeing those problems emerging in our schools as well. There are school boards that across the state are considering proposals to, for example, require parental notification as a matter of course about a child's gender identity or gender expression. There are school boards and towns that are taking efforts to try and ban certain books about the LGBTQ experience. And so we as a state aren't immune from that, and that's why our division, I think, really does have a role to play on these issues, because the law against discrimination, as Amy said, provides some of the strongest protections in the country against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and we've got to enforce that law.
Your office also is involved with hate and bias incidents. Can you talk about the work that you do in that area, and what you see in terms of trends in that? As the rabbi said, and I know you're aware, and our own community was the victim of an attempted attack, and it seems to be on the rise everywhere you look.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is on the rise across the state. We've been tracking as a state for almost 30 years now bias incidents each year. And in 2021, we set a record for the number of bias incidents that we observed across the state. 2022, it looks like we have considerably exceeded that number. And the preliminary figures suggest in 2021, there were about 1,900 bias incidents across our state. That's increased to about 2,200 across our state in 2022. And this is affecting virtually every group across our state. Anti-Semitic bias incidents have considerably increased in the last 4 or 5 years that we've been tracking these numbers, and there were about 350 or so in that were anti-Semitic, that were targeting people on the basis of their on the basis of being Jewish in 2021, and that number has increased substantially in 2022. And so we're really dealing with a challenge at all levels of government here in New Jersey and in all communities across our state. And our Attorney General and the Governor are committed to ensuring that we really have a whole of government response. It's not enough just to say we're going to treat this as a problem of criminal enforcement. It undoubtedly is in appropriate circumstances. Our law enforcement works tirelessly, as they did here, in order to ensure that perpetrators are held accountable, that hate and bias doesn't have a place in our state. But there are other tools that our department has as well in order to address hate and bias when it does crop up. Our division handles civil enforcement, and one of the things that we have authority along with the AG is to bring civil enforcement actions in response to bias incidents. And that's important because it's not always easy to bring a criminal action in response to a bias incident. Criminal law just has higher standards of proof. There are intent requirements, and sometimes it can be difficult to bring a criminal case. And that's where civil enforcement can be particularly important. But I think we've also got to go beyond enforcement and not just think about what happens after an incident occurs, but how do we stop these things from happening in the first place? And that's something that our team at the Division on Civil Rights gives a lot of thought to every single day. We're out engaging communities across the state, trying to build bridges rather than tear them down, bring communities together so that we can foster understanding across lines. But we also have, and I'm proud to say, we're really a model in this respect. We have an education and training unit at the Division on Civil Rights that goes out into communities and does anti-bias trainings. And I think about this as our proactive anti-bias work. They offer trainings on bystander intervention, how to be an upstander rather than just a bystander. They offer trainings on implicit bias and how we overcome implicit bias. They offer trainings on the protections that the law against discrimination affords and the reasons why those protections are so important across all of the many groups that are protected under our law against discrimination. And so that work is really critical, I think, to ensuring that we're engaging communities in conversations to prevent the next bias incident from occurring. And we're not in a position in this state where we can say we're going to be able to drive down the number of bias incidents to zero. There are unfortunately so many that are happening each day, but I think we have to commit and redouble our efforts to ensure that we're getting at the root causes of hate and bias. The other thing I'll just add on this is I think one of the root causes of the increase in bias and hate has been the rise of social media. And social media provides a place for hateful extremists to gather and to spread vicious ideologies. And the Attorney General, I know, is deeply committed to holding social media companies accountable when they have terms of service that say, we're going to moderate our content appropriately, and then they don't do that. And I'm proud to say our Attorney General has been really on the forefront of efforts to hold social media companies accountable, and I think it's a big part of the ongoing effort that we all need in order to tackle some of the underlying drivers of bias and hate.
A couple follow-ups on that. You talked about about anti-bias training. What kind of audience do you provide that training for? Is this for schools? Is it for community groups? Who's the intended audience for this kind of training?
Yeah, all of the above. So we are very active in schools. We're actually just starting now a anti-bias campaign in colleges and universities across the state, because we know this is a particular problem in the numbers that we've seen on our college campuses. But it extends beyond that. It's to community members, to our various stakeholders, to government and law enforcement officials. So it really spans the gamut, and I think that's necessary because we've got to try and get this message out to as many people as we can across the state, because it really does take all of us in order to address a problem like this.
Thank you. And we are keenly aware in our congregation and in our Jewish community of the rise of anti-Semitic incidents and bias crimes. But what are you seeing in terms of bias and hate incidents against other ethnic groups or practitioners of other religions? I would imagine that's going up as well.
Yeah, it is really across every group. We're seeing anti-Black hate incidents increase at an alarming clip across the state, and it continues to be the #1 motivation driving hate and bias incidents. We're seeing it across a whole variety of religious groups. Islamophobia continues to be on the rise across the state. We're seeing it across a whole host of ethnic groups. Anti-Asian hate continues to be on the rise. And I'll say that there is, I think, an underlying thread, regardless of the group, which is the rise in recent years of white supremacy and white supremacist extremist ideologies. And we're seeing that increase on social media. We're seeing people, unfortunately, feel comfortable gathering openly in public. We've seen a lot of that in the last couple of years. And that white supremacist ideology targets every single one of the groups that I mentioned. It's a common denominator behind a lot of the hate and bias incidents that we're seeing.
Not good news, but good for us to be aware of. So I think we're probably heading toward closure. But one thing that I know I'm interested in, and I hope others are too, is there anything that we can do as citizens to try to support a more diverse community that is not practicing discrimination either on its face or in those more sophisticated ways, and to be upstanders rather than bystanders? Any advice for us?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I think we live in this incredibly polarized moment, and there are a lot of reasons for that polarization. And I don't just mean polarization in the political sense. I think we are further apart from our neighbors, our communities, than we maybe have ever been. And I think that has some really corrosive effects. It's a lot easier to other someone when you don't interact with them. And I think it's incredibly important for all of us to be really conscious about trying to build bridges where we can. Now, that doesn't mean putting yourself in harm's way. And I think you have to make sure that you feel safe when you're doing that. And I think the reality is that appropriately so, some communities in our state may not feel safe building those bridges with other folks. And I think it is incredibly important that we as a state government try and play the role of building some of that community trust so that people can feel comfortable with people who are different than them. The other thing that I'll say that's important from my perspective is when in doubt, don't hesitate to report something to us. I think there's a tendency among most of us to downplay some of what we might consider to be the more minor incidents in our day-to-day lives. You might think, this is something that happens to me all the time, or this happens in my community all the time. And just because that's true doesn't make it okay, and it doesn't make it legal either. And the only way that we can ultimately take action on bias and hate and discrimination in our communities is if we know about it. So when in doubt, don't hesitate to report to us. You can go online, bias.njcivilrights.gov. It's pretty easy to remember. It's very easy to file a complaint with us, and let us be the judge of whether what you've experienced or what you've seen in your community is unlawful discrimination. But even if it isn't, it's something that we need to know about so that we can think about how we do proactive outreach, how we can build those bridges to avoid that next incident.
Thank you so much, Sundeep.
Thank you.
Pleasure to speak with you and to get to know you.
All right, so we'll take a few questions, I think. We have time for a few.
Could you give a couple of concrete examples about bridge building in communities, examples of communities, what you've done, and then if you've seen any obvious results?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most prominent examples here in New Jersey has been the work that has been done to build bridges between the Muslim and the Jewish communities. And, you know, I think there has been a lot of work between faith leaders in the Jewish community and the Muslim community to try and build those bridges. Now, I don't think that has been something that has been uniformly successful across the state, and there's still more work to do. But you know, I see our agency as having a role to play in trying to build those bridges and bring those people together so that there's shared understanding and shared support also. You know, I think when a bias incident happens, you don't want to just have the support of the people in your community. I think it's so critical. And I think we saw that here. At least in what I witnessed, there was an outpouring of support from really across the area. And I think that is incredibly powerful. And it sends a message not just of support, but that this is something that we as a community collectively won't tolerate. And I think that is really, really important.
I was wondering whether you have experienced any opposition from groups in the legislature against the programs that your division puts forward.
I think that there is always some opposition to work that attempts to advance civil rights, but I do think that New Jersey as a whole, and I think this is true really regardless of partisan affiliation here in the state, it is a state that is committed to advancing civil rights. We may not always agree on you know, a particular issue, but I don't think that we've encountered the same level of opposition that you might see in a lot of other parts of the country.
Warmer parts of the country.
How many attorneys do you have in your civil rights division, and do you have enough?
So we've got a staff of about 85, and it's comprised of both lawyers and non-lawyer investigators, other administrative professionals, and you know, we can do a lot with the folks that we have. Now, I think any civil rights organization could always use more resources, but for me, that's not an excuse for not being out in the communities that we serve. It's not an excuse for not doing aggressive enforcement. We've got resources, and we've got to be able to use them to advance the cause of civil rights here in the state.
Free speech is a very difficult needle to thread. The shutting down of speakers and cancel culture is a crime committed by all areas of all spectra of political thought in this country, especially on college campuses where certain speakers are not allowed to speak, others are encouraged to speak. How do you handle this?
Yeah, I'm not the only person in the country that recognizes that this is, I think, a challenging issue that a lot of our college campuses are facing right now. I think the thing I'll say here is it's critical that we be able to be in rooms with and hear from people who may have different views than us. I think that goes to the bridge building point. You know, it's difficult to build those bridges when you're not able to be in those same rooms. There is, however, a point at which I think that being in those rooms may not be productive, and it's so context dependent. I think the biggest thing for colleges and universities is setting clear ground rules at the outset and then adhering to them and applying them, regardless of who the speaker is. And I think where folks sometimes get into trouble is when they don't do that.
You spoke earlier about social media and the ways that hate is amplified, and that's really what's new, isn't it? In the last 15 to 20 years, the ways that that hate can spread. It's like a virus. And I'm curious to what degree your office is able to monitor that. Is law enforcement monitoring the sources of hate speech? I mean, it obviously crosses borders, but to what degree are you able to follow it?
Yeah, law enforcement, I think, is paying close attention to potential threats on social media and the genesis of hate on social media. We're lucky here in New Jersey to have some of the strongest capabilities for doing that. And we've got state police who, in my view, are among the tech savviest of law enforcement officials across the state. And it's how we often end up detecting potential threats in the first place, whether it's to houses of worship or other venues. And so I think this is something that law enforcement is paying really close attention to because it has to.
I'd like to thank you for coming. It's been very interesting. One of my concerns is the issue of police. The Star Ledger had a recent story about a suit against the state police, which has been an ongoing problem with discrimination within the police force. The Clark police chief there's been an investigation, I guess, by your division, I don't know, for the past year and a half. It hasn't been resolved yet. What is your office doing about, and then, of course, there's the Patterson issues. So what is your office doing on that, and what can be done to make real reforms happen more quickly?
Yeah. So I'll say at the outset, I can't comment on any pending investigations that we've got. On law enforcement, though, the law against discrimination is broad. It applies to law enforcement as places of public accommodations. And so that means they have exactly the same obligations as any other employer to not discriminate with respect to their employees. But it also means that when they're engaging with the public, they can't engage either in disparate treatment of individuals in the public on the basis of race or any other characteristic, or in policies. They can't have policies or procedures that will have a disparate impact. And that means they may treat all groups equally on its face, but if a particular policy, setting up a checkpoint in a particular place, has a disparate impact on, say, the Black community in a particular area, that is something that could potentially trigger law against discrimination liability. And it's something that we are paying close attention to as the Division on Civil Rights. And it's something that the entire department, the Attorney General on down, are paying close attention to as well. Our obligations and our law enforcement have obligations under our law against discrimination.
So I wasn't going to take any questions from online because it's difficult to do that. But I actually see that the hand that's up is James Harris. So James, I want to give you the ability to ask a question.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate this presentation, and thank you for bringing it on board. The information says that there's been an increase in bias incidents. I wonder, has there been an increase in staff in the division to handle the complaints, and what is the average time from filing a complaint to having it researched and resolved?
So I don't know the answer on the average amount of time, and I'll say these investigations are context specific, but they're a priority for the department as a whole. And I think you saw that in the way that our federal and state and local law enforcement partners collaborated in the aftermath of what happened here. And I think to the staffing question, I think there has been an increase in recognition of some of the real challenges that we face as a state.
Thank you. So I saw 1, 2, 3 hands, and that'll be the end of our questions, I think. So.
I know you're in an executive agency in the government. Are there changes to our laws or our constitution on the state level that your division would like to see happen, that you're working to have happen, or are you strictly implementing current law?
I mean, we focus largely on the law that we've got. There is a pending bill in the legislature that would make a whole host of changes to the law against discrimination. Among other things, it would add immigration and citizenship status as protected characteristics under the law against discrimination. And I think changes like that can be important in expanding the scope of our laws. But I'll say what I said at the outset. We've got the benefit here of some of the strongest anti-discrimination laws in the country. Could they be better? Always. But I think our job, my job, first and foremost, is to make sure that we're enforcing those laws.
I have really more of a comment that one of the areas that discrimination can be hidden pretty well is in the healthcare delivery system. It can be very subtle. And one of the things my organization has done is engage in implicit bias training, especially with the providers and nurses, so that if the providers who are giving the care or the nurses who do care coordination and interact with patients frequently, they're aware of what their implicit bias might be and more likely to open up the widest variety of options for the patient. And so when you were talking about communities and how does the word get out, this, I think, was delivered through a consortium of Rutgers University, Department of Public Policy. There was a payer, maybe Horizon. I think there was a large hospital system involved, and this consortium offered it kind of across healthcare providers in the state. So that's just another area where implicit bias is being addressed.
Yeah, that's a really helpful flag, and I'll just add to that healthcare delivery and racial disparities in healthcare delivery in particular are something that we have a close eye on at the division. Healthcare facilities are places of public accommodation. They're subject to our law against discrimination, and so that's another area that we're paying close attention to.
Same-day voter registration. Why don't we have it? And is that something your office would be involved with?
That is not something that our office is involved in.
All right. So we've covered a lot this evening. All the various ways that your department interacts with our community and makes this world a better place. And so Amy Winkelman, Sundeep Iyer, let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you again to Carrie. Thank you again for the Federation of Greater Metro West, JCRC, Jewish Relations Council. Linda's here, and I want to welcome her. And to the NAACP, as well as Out Montclair. Thank you for joining us, for those who are online, for those who are here. We're going to make this recording available in the coming week or so on our YouTube page and probably spread it around to the partners also who co-sponsored. But thank you, and we can't wait to continue to work with you on really doing some good stuff for our community, and you keep up the great work. So thank you. So meet someone new on your way out.